I think it is safe to say that as a society, we could use a little more humility because our culture today places so much value on external accomplishment, appearances, self-aggrandizement, and all things that are ephemeral at best, that even a small display of this quiet virtue can make one feel like a drowning man coming up for air. In today's episode, we are going to take a look at what humility looks like according to chapter 2 of Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. That is coming up next. Hi everyone, my name is Nashi Uhuru. Welcome to the Uhuru Reports, where we share principles about life and godliness in the simplicity of the good news. What is ego? Ego is a self-generated identity consisting of every belief we believe about who and what we are. This includes our personalities, our talents, our likes and dislikes. The ego is what keeps us locked away in our mind in an endless circle of chatters separated from the present moment. It is the identity created and reinforced by the story we tell ourselves. These are merely stories that do not make up who we are. Humility is one of our core values as Christians. It helps us stay grounded by reminding us where we came from and of those who helped us along the journey. Success can be the greatest threat to the future of any Christian, mostly to any leader, if humility is replaced by arrogance. Romans chapter 12 verse 3 reminds us that it is very important to stay grounded, that we should not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. Otherwise, as Proverbs chapter 16 verse 18 describes it, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. In other words, first pride, then the crash. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. Philippians chapter 2 opens up with the principle of how we should live our daily lives, and then went on to paint a picture of how Jesus Christ applied this principle in his life when he lived on the earth. The chapter begins by telling us that if our experience of Christ's encouragement and love means anything to us, and if we have known something of the fellowship of his Spirit and all that it means in kindness and deep sympathy, that we should have the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. The question is, what is this mind? Number one, that we should not do anything out of selfish motive or with vain conceit. Number two, we must consider other people as more valuable and more important than ourselves. And number three, that we should not just look at our own interests, the things that we are interested in, but also look out for the interests of others. Now, the first mindset we are encouraged to adapt is the mindset of sacrifice. Notice verse 6. It says, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. That means he did not consider his heavenly position and his equality with God something that he had to tightly hold on to, but rather he emptied himself or sacrificed himself. Think about that. Jesus had a perfect setup in heaven where there is no pain, no sorrow, no difficulties. The heavenly host all available to worship him, yet he chose voluntarily to give up that which was valuable to him and to come down to this earth, not to be a king, but a servant. The question now is, if we say we want to be like Jesus, are we willing to give up those things that are valuable to us? Whether it may be our time or our money for God, or for those that we are in a relationship with. The second mindset is the mindset of a servant. Question is, are we willing to be a servant that serve and not to be served? In verse 7, the Bible tells us that rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Here we see Jesus takes another step down in terms of humility, in the sense that he did not just come to the earth to be a king and to be served, but rather every time we see Jesus, he is in a position of a servant, serving people, washing people's feet, feeding people, raising people from the dead, teaching, healing, and doing miracles. The question we must challenge ourselves with is, do I look more often to be served or to serve other people? Or do I see myself as above doing certain tasks that these things are beneath me? Or even more, do I see myself as being willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done? The third mindset is the mindset of submission. In verse 8, we read that Jesus was willing to be obedient even to the point of death. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. Again, we see Jesus takes further steps down toward humility, in the sense that before he even gets to earth, he first had to be willingly to be submissive to God the Father. Remember that Jesus was just as much God as the Father, and yet for this assignment, he was willing to surrender and to submit his will in exchange for the will of the Father. So now, the question that we must ask ourselves is, how submissive am I willing to be in terms of relationship, whether with your husband or with our wives, co-workers, neighbors, and church leadership? Or am I the type of person that always need to be in control and having other people submit to me? The fourth mindset is probably the most uncomfortable and undesirable. That is the idea of suffering. The previous verse said that Jesus was obedient to the point of death. And now it says even death on a cross. The idea here is that Jesus was willing to suffer and go through difficulties and tribulation so that we could inherit eternal life. He was in pain, struggling. He went through difficult times and ultimately had to willingly give his life for a ransom. And the question is, if we say that we are going to be like Jesus Christ, how willing are we to be inconvenienced and to suffer for the gospel, or even in our relationship with others? So, what does it mean to have the mind of Christ? In our context, is the willingness to sacrifice ourselves, the willingness to serve one another, being submissive to one another, the willingness to suffer for the gospel's sake. So, the ultimate blessing of taming our ego, according to Philippians chapter 2, is that if we are willing to humble ourselves as Jesus humbled himself, that led to God exalting him, in due times He will do the same for you and for I.